All right. So, remote lesson this week will focus on a document that you may or may not have heard of, but this document is especially relevant this year in 2020. So, let me talk a little bit about the background, give you some context for the Declaration of Sentiments. So, the Declaration of Sentiments was a document that was essentially the Declaration of Independence, but for women. So I'm going to give you a little bit of women's rights history, and I'll explain why 2020 is especially significant. So, the authors of this document that I will be reading with you are Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott. They wrote the Declaration of Sentiments for the Seneca Falls Women's Rights Convention that was held in 1848 in upstate New York. They deliberately modeled the Declaration of Sentiments on the Declaration of Independence. And you'll see a lot of similarities whenever I get to the document itself. Some other really notable women's rights supporters were Susan B. Anthony. I think she showed up on a dollar coin a few years back, and Lucy Stone. Unfortunately, none of these four women would live to see the day that women gained the right to vote. So Susan B. Anthony was fully committed to the cause of women's rights. She toured the nation. She spoke publicly on women's rights. Sometimes she was listened to, sometimes rotten tomatoes were thrown in her general direction. So it was considered a pretty controversial topic back then, the idea of women being extended more rights than they already had. So, rights that were at issue. So, first off, domestic abuse. So, one state upheld the decision of a husband to beat his wife, saying that to do otherwise would defeat the domestic harmony of the home. Okay. Another right that was at stake were women's rights to property and education. Now, those rights, by most people who supported the idea of women's rights, were pretty fully supported. The one that was controversial, even amongst women who supported, having more rights, was the right to vote. So there was some debate at the Seneca Falls Convention. Should we ask for this right to vote? I don't know. I don't really think that maybe that's something that we really need. Right to property and right to education. Well, yeah, we should have that. But right to vote, maybe that's taking it a step too far. So anyways, it was a big discussion for sure. So the Declaration of Sentiments marks this first formal action of women in the United States to gain civil rights, the right to own property and the right to education, and suffrage, which is much more positive than the word sounds, which is the right to vote. So it was signed officially by 68 women and 32 men, who were about 100 out of some 300 attendees at the first Women's Rights Convention in Seneca Falls, New York. Women did not gain the vote until 1920, 72 years later. So you see now why 2020 is so important, because 2020 marks the 100th anniversary of the right of women to actually vote for elected officials in this country. So yay, voting. Okay, a little bit of a timeline before I get into the document. Back in 1872, Susan B. Anthony and a few others, as a form of protest, attempted to vote. Obviously, it was unsuccessful, but they were arrested and they were put on trial for attempting to vote. During her trial, Susan was not allowed to testify on her own behalf, and the judge commanded the all-male jury to find her guilty. So it was a horrible violation of her rights, and she was understandably very furious about the way that went. Then fast forward to 1917, the National American Women's Suffrage Association met with the president at the time, so president finally paying attention to the demands. They also began picketing the White House, and many were arrested for their actions, so using their powers of civil disobedience to gain attention and support for their cause and try to fight for the right to vote. And then in 1918, a court declared the White House suffrage protest arrest to be invalid. So it said that these women who were picketing did not have the right to be arrested, and it basically nullified their arrests. Slightly earlier, in 1918, the House of Representatives had passed what was known as the Anthony Amendment, named after Susan B. Anthony, but the Senate failed to pass it. In 1919, the following year, the House of Representatives passed the Anthony Amendment again, and finally, the United States Senate approved the Anthony Amendment, and it was officially signed into law on August 26th, 1920. So we are just about at the 100th anniversary. So anyways, the 19th Amendment, or I guess we're actually slightly past the 100th anniversary. Anyways, the 19th Amendment now guarantees women the right to vote. So yay for that. Okay, the Declaration of Sentiments is set up very, very similar to the Declaration of Independence. So let me just read this first paragraph and see if any bits of it sound familiar to you. When, in the course of human events, it becomes necessary for one portion of the family of man to assume among the people of the earth a position different from that which they have hitherto occupied, but one to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes that impel them to such a course. So if you were to highlight all of the words in this paragraph that were different from the Declaration of Independence, you wouldn't have a whole lot to point out. So when in the course of human events it becomes necessary, that is word for word identical. Then instead of, one nation, it's one portion of the family of man. So we're, obviously hearkening to the women's struggle here. Let's see, we have laws of nature and nature's God entitle them. That was in the original one. Decent respect to the opinions of, and then they have mankind to indicate, respecting the opinions of men rather than the original text from the Declaration of Independence. So it's very, very similar, almost word for word, except for the bits that needed to be changed to make sense. Then we get to the statement of beliefs. We hold these truths to be self-evident, sounding very familiar, that all men and women are created equal. So the only thing they did there was add the phrase "and women," trying to say like, hey, this was sort of left out of the original Declaration. How about we add that in there? We get some equality as well. That they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Again, word for word, all of that. That to secure these rights, governments are instituting, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, word for word. Whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of those who suffer from it to refuse allegiance to it. So this, I think, is an interesting phrase to replace, because, of course, the reason they call this the Declaration of Sentiments rather than the Declaration of Independence is that they're not trying to separate from the rest of the country. It's not advocating for the segregation of men and women, but they are saying, these are our thoughts, these are our beliefs, and we cannot show allegiance and loyalty to a country that is denying us these rights. So, and I think allegiance is also interesting because we think of allegiance, we think of the Pledge of Allegiance. So I can just imagine, the women back in the day, if there's an event where someone's saying the Pledge of Allegiance, what do they do? Do they kneel Colin Kaepernick style? Do they just, not put their hand over their heart? I imagine, perhaps there were some subtle protests in there. But anyways, they are refusing allegiance and insisting upon the institution of a new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its power in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. Prudence, indeed, will dictate that governments long established should not be changed for light and transient causes. So that phrase taken word for word. Mankind are more disposed to suffer while evils are sufferable. Definitely directly quoted. Abuses and usurpations, that's taken straight from the Declaration. Absolute despotism, taken straight from the Declaration. So there are quite a few similarities, and then obviously little bits that have been changed. The patient sufferance of the women under this government rather than, of the colonies or whatever the original was. But this is definitely their way of hearkening to that original document. Now, one question, of course, is why would they make their declaration so similar to the original? I mentioned that it was purposeful. They did it intentionally. They didn't just accidentally plagiarize these two paragraphs here. But why would they do that? Were they just not smart enough to come up with their own document? Obviously, that's a wrong answer right there. Don't say that. But think about what the point would be of taking the original declaration and modifying it to suit their cause. Why is that important? Now, this next section is entirely different. So the list of complaints for the colonists obviously were very specific, government issues. The list of complaints for women is a very different list of issues. So, of course, we have discussion about legislation. They have no voice in the creation of legislation. They have to submit to laws that they don't have any voice in creating. They do not have the right to vote. Let's see, what other notable ones here? This one's some nice figurative language here. He has made her, if married, in the eye of the law, civilly dead. So marriage is civil death. It is the death of the ability to own one's own property. It is the death of the ability to do anything that your husband didn't really want you to do. So definitely some nice strong language there. And just as with the original declaration, each line does start with he has. But in this case, of course, the he is not King George III. It is man. Man has not permitted us to do these things. Man has made her do these things and, administer chastisement and all of these other bad, no good, rotten things. Definitely still continuing. Lots and lots of complaints. Different code of morals for men and women. I think we still see that somewhat nowadays. Destroying confidence, lessening self-respect, making her willing to lead a dependent and abject life. So women's independence and empowerment is a relatively new thing in terms of, the history of the world. Laws of divorce were heavily weighted towards men. Anyways, lots and lots of bad things. You can read them in more detail. And then they skip the kind of counter-argument section that the original declaration has and just go right into declaration. Because this was their first action, so they didn't really have much to say in the way of, we have attempted to talk to men about this before. This is the first time that they are making this formal action. So, in view of this disfranchisement of one half the people of this country, social and religious degradation. Ooh, good vocabulary there. In view of these unjust laws, women feel aggrieved, oppressed, and fraudulently deprived of their most sacred rights. So, we insist immediate admission to the rights and privileges which belong to them as citizens of the United States. All the things that men can do, we'd like to be able to do those too. Thank you very much. So, there's the Declaration of Sentiments. And I do have the full text of the document here, so you don't have to read it in PowerPoint form. But yes, I just have a few questions for you related to the Declaration of Sentiments. One of them is the question that I asked you earlier, and then others I have kind of answered for you, or I'm sure that you can figure out with very little trouble. So just to make sure you understand the importance of this document in the history of women's rights and the significance, the rhetorical significance of formatting and organizing it the way that they did. So that's it for week 3, Wednesday.